afternoon, and thank you for stopping by Across the Fence. I'm Keith Silva. Remember this? Something so ubiquitous, so profuse, so bad for the environment, it's a wonder we could live without the humble plastic bag. But we do, and we have. Single-use plastic bags have been banned in Vermont since July of 2020. UVM researchers recently dug into a 2022 survey to find out how the modest plastic bag went from everywhere to almost nowhere in short order. To talk about plastic bags, surveys, and research, I'm joined by Emily Belarmino. She teaches in UVM's Food Systems and Nutrition and Food Science programs, and she is also a fellow with the UVM Gunda Institute and one of the co-authors of this recent study about Vermont's plastic bag ban. Welcome, Emily.
Thanks so much, Keith.
Thank you. So many of our viewers remember carrying their groceries and other odds and ends in these one-use plastic bags and wondering where to recycle them. I remember that being something that was very frustrating, but where do I recycle them? Remind us about the legislation that bans the one-use plastic bag.
Yeah, so in 2019, Act 69 was passed, and Act 69 was the single-use products law. It addressed plastic bags, it also addressed paper bags, and a few other items. Styrofoam containers, you might remember them.
Sure.
We haven't seen them in a few years.
Nope.
Plastic straws, and also plastic stirrers. And so the idea was to reduce Vermonters' use of these single-use items and also help keep them out of our landfill.
Okay, so this ban goes into place, the legislation happens July 1st. What happens after that, and fairly quickly?
Yeah, so very quickly what we saw, our study was conducted in 2022, so about 18 months after the ban came into place. And what we saw was this dramatic drop in plastic bag use, about 91% drop. So before the ban, many Vermonters were using, on average, 6.5 plastic bags per week. And after the ban came into effect, people were using less than one plastic bag per week.
That's remarkable. I mean, that drop-off, it was like flipping a switch. As you said, the single-use law prohibits the distribution of single-use plastic carry-out bags, and but purchasers could buy a paper bag, and that's part of this legislation that's a little twist in a way. So talk about that part of it.
Yeah, that's a really important piece of the legislation. So not only was the use of plastic carryout bags banned, but the legislation also included a provision that said, well, you can continue to use paper bags if you want, but retailers have to charge at least 10 cents per paper bag. They could charge more, but they need to charge at least 10 cents in order to disincentivize the substitution of plastic bags for paper bags, because we know that paper bags have their own environmental challenges associated with them, especially in the production process.
A lot of frugality in Vermont, a lot of Yankee ingenuity. A dime was too much for people. People were like, nope, a dime is too big of an ask to switch over.
For many people. So we were really curious if even with 10 cents, we were going to see this swap from plastic to paper. And instead what we saw was only the most minor increase in paper bag use. So less than one paper bag per week increase. In fact, it was only about 0.1 paper bag more was used per household per week across the state of Vermont. Which is really interesting, because what it tells us is that the combination of the plastic bag ban and the paper bag fee is very effective in getting people to use reusable bags or some other type of reusable carry-out container.
It's remarkable. We'll talk a little bit more about how that gets into this legislation and why this legislation is important. The survey that you talked to that happened about 18 months after this ban went in place was from the Vermonter poll, which is conducted by UVM Center for Rural Studies. What did you have to do? What is the Vermonter poll, and what is your job as a researcher with what findings in that poll?
Yeah, the Vermonter poll is a really cool instrument for understanding sort of the pulse of the state of Vermont. So every year, the Center for Rural Studies surveys a random sample of adults in Vermont, pretty large random sample, and the margin of error on that poll is really similar to what you would have for some of the major polling. You can think about political polling, for example. And so every year, Vermonter Poll goes out and asks people a set of questions. And these questions are different every year. And so what that allows us to do is understand sort of the pulse on different topics. And researchers or organizations across the state are able to put in any questions that they feel are important or relevant for understanding particular issues. And so in 2022, we added questions about paper bag use, plastic bag use, and opinions about this policy package and what people thought, maybe should or could happen moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Remarkable, the Vermonter Poll, what a great tool for researchers like yourself. Across the Fence was once and has many times been on the Vermonter Poll. Do you watch Across the Fence? We'll have to get back into the Vermonter Poll. If anyone wants to read this article for themselves, it was published in the Journal of Environmental Economics and Policy Studies. Plastic bags are a thing of the past. For the most part, we were talking before we started recording. Animal waste, still a thing that goes into plastic bags. What was the point of studying this? Like, problem solved, Emily. Why do we have to dredge up the plastic bag again?
Yeah, great question. So one of the things that we've seen across the country is this proliferation in interest in banning plastic bags. And so many times it's happening in local municipalities. Sometimes it's happening at the state level. We don't have federal legislation related to plastic bags. But we really wanted to understand this policy package, what happens if you ban plastic bags and you disincentivize the use of paper bags together. Because even though there's been a lot of interest in this, Keith, there hasn't been much evaluation. And so as more states and more municipalities are thinking about, how do we want to address this challenge locally, we need to understand what works and what doesn't work. And what we found in this case is that, this package in Vermont seems to work really well.
Right. And that's not to say that this package in Montana would work as well, but at least it's a model that shows how it worked in this particular, in this place. When you looked over the results of the Vermonter Poll, people responded positively. I can't imagine a piece of legislation that has acceptance across the board. Is that weird? Was there anything in that legislation that you saw, any sort of little quirks to it that sort of stood out for you?
I think I want to pick up on the first piece that you said first, like people responded positively. Absolutely. And I think that is really, really important and interesting here, is that this piece of legislation was really responding to existing need and interest across the state. And so people were eager for it to come into place. It was addressing a challenge that people were noticing in their own lives. You mentioned yourself, like, how do I recycle this? What do I do with this? Right. And so after the law came into place, we found that there was very, very high public opinion about the law. We had the vast majority of people who were surveyed telling us both that they feel an obligation to to cut back on their plastic bag use, and also that they feel that any economic costs that might be associated with this particular ban are worth it because of the environmental benefits. So I think that's a really key element, is that Vermonters wanted this. Right.
I was sort of thinking it's like the slow pitch. This one was put on the tee just to whack away. People were willing. There was a willing audience for this. One of the aspects of the laws that one of your co-authors mentioned, and what we're talking about, is what's called a bottom-up origin. Explain that to the layperson as far as what bottom-up origins are with policy.
Yeah. So the state of Vermont wasn't the first to do this. Here locally, we actually saw Brattleboro pass a local ordinance in 2018, so a year before the state of Vermont, and they came up with their own policy about plastic bag use in order to cut back on plastic bags within Brattleboro. And so the state of Vermont took some ideas there, but I think what really happened is the state started to take notice of the interest in this. And we, as I just mentioned, like a lot of people are very, very satisfied and happy with this particular piece of legislation, this policy package. And part of that is that they wanted it before it came into place. Legislators were responding to public interest and public need. So this bottom-up idea is that people wanted it. Brattleboro was already on board. And so then the state said, okay, rather than having every town in Vermont have their own policy as it relates to plastic bags, like let's do this at a state level to try to bring some consistency across what's happening.
Right. It feels, this is how democracy is supposed to work, right? The people want something, it goes up the chain, and everybody accepts it. Does that make this legislation a blueprint for other legislations or other bills, or as you said, in other states? Does this sort of this is how you do it, guys?
I think that there's things that can be learned from this, especially this idea of really trying to understand what the demand is. And there was demand here on both sides, right? There was the population of Vermont that is very environmentally conscious and eager to cut back on their footprint. And you have the fact that we have just one landfill, and that landfill has a timeline on it.
Right.
And so this was an opportunity to sort of meet in the middle and address these needs at the same time.
Interesting, very interesting. I was thinking about it when I found this in the house today, that, whenever they were talking about how bad single-use plastic bags, there were pictures of turtles caught in the handles and things like that, but we weren't even talking about microplastics back then, and now microplastics are all the thing. What is your takeaway from this work that you've learned yourself as a researcher?
So I think the big thing that I would say is that policy, when designed really well and in response to clear needs, is an amazing way to change behavior. And this sort of transcends lots of different categories.
Sure.
But in this particular instance, many people wanted to reduce their use of plastics, but it's hard when you're at the grocery store and you think like, okay, I forgot my bags. And, but by changing the policy, you make this a habit.
My thanks to the crew behind the scenes here at WCX. I'm Keith Silva. This is Across the Fence. Thanks for being part of our family.